It's time now for our news review segment where we take a look at one of our stories in more detail. The Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and Jordan's King Abdullah II have held a phone call for the first time since foreign-backed militancy broke out in Syria a decade ago. In a statement on Sunday, the Jordanian palace announced the news and said the two leaders discussed bilateral relations and ways of enhancing mutual cooperation. King Abdullah II, according to the statement, told Assad that his country supported the territorial integrity of Syria, as well as efforts to safeguard its stability and sovereignty. Amman reduced diplomatic relations with Damascus following the outbreak of foreign-sponsored militancy in Syria in 2011. However, Jordan has taken steps in recent months to normalize ties with Damascus. Last week, for example, Jordan fully reopened a border crossing with Syria to reinforce investment and trade. Jordan also said it would resume direct flights to Syria. So joining us is Ian Williams, a senior analyst at Foreign Policy in Focus from New York, and also Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist from Bristol, that's in Britain. Gentlemen, welcome. And Tony, if I can start with you. 10 years ago, Jordan allowed the CIA to train, arm and fund foreign-backed militants in Jordanian territory. What's changed since then, in your opinion?
Well, the tectonic plates of the world have been shifting, haven't they? They've been moving around, and what's happened is any kind of reasonably independent nation, and particularly sovereigns like the Middle Eastern. For example, in this case, it's King Abdullah in Jordan. They are starting to wonder which side they're on, and if you look at the geography of it, I think it's just to describe for people who aren't clear about the map. What you've got is you've got the Lebanon to the west, next to the Mediterranean, and then Syria. This is at the north. Just south of that, you've got Jordan on the east, and next to the Mediterranean, you have Israel. So this is an incredibly sensitive area between Lebanon and Israel and Syria. There's been a tremendous amount of fighting, literal geopolitics over the last 40 or 50 years around this area. And so the idea that now you've got the Jordanians starting to have a rapprochement with Syria, this is really, I think, all because of the Russian military intervention with the proxy wars going on within Syria. The Russians have had enough of it, and then when they went in, the locals began to see what was going on, which was a long-term attempt by Israel and the West, particularly the United States and Britain, to destabilize the Middle East, to balkanize the Middle East, to break these countries up. And I think what's happened over the last decade is the Jordanian intelligence or Jordanian officials and those with wealth in Jordan have realized that they have to be much more independent-minded when it comes to the West. They can't just keep flying backwards and forwards to New York to London, having parties and things with the people who are preying on their region and on their country, because they rely, as the Saudis have done, of course, they've been doing all that. And so that's, I think, what's changed. I think there's also something I'd just like to mention, which is very interesting today in the news. We've had a succession of leaks over the years to do with financial information about powerful figures around the world. And just today we've had this new thing. It's called the Pandora Papers. Has been leaked in London, and it includes a lot of private details of the Jordanian king. So of course he's not going to be happy about that either. Now, the way these leaks happen, of course, for journalists it's great, and for journalists and for the public it's fascinating to see the insight into these top people and their financial dealings, sometimes money laundering, this sort of thing. But the way these leaks are done is very partial. So sometimes, for example, in leaks in the past, there's been a load of leaks about MPs in Britain, about their financial information, but funnily enough, nothing about Tony Blair. So what I find interesting about these leaks is not just that we're seeing corruption at high levels in finance, but that it's very partial. So, for example, it can be a political leak. We could have leaks this time, for example, it's about Putin too. And so we're not seeing leaks on the top people in the United States. So I think the Jordanian authorities will now be looking at this as just one more nail in the coffin of the relationship between Jordan and the West.
Right. Well, you know, Ian, we've heard from many experts that say the United States and its allies in West Asia initiated the war on Syria. And, you know, when we hear reports of Jordan and others that are now re-engaging with Damascus, do you see that as a sign of failure from Washington and Tel Aviv?
I am somebody who has never said that the insurrection in Syria was a Western plot. They ended up backing it, but it was an indigenous plot for democracy against the repression of the Syrian regime, which incidentally used to do contract torture for the CIA. Now, all of these regimes are completely cynical. The Hashemites have had their hands in the till for a long time. King Abdullah's father before him was dipping the till and taking money abroad, looting the state treasury, impoverishing the people, with a sense of degree and decorum that was missing from many of the other local potentates. But that's mostly because they didn't have as much money. We have to remember Jordan is in a very precarious position.
Ian, are you denying that this? Are you denying that? Ian, are you denying? Ian, are you denying that the CIA trained, funded, and armed militants in Jordan in 2011?
I'm saying they might have done afterwards, but the insurrection started because of the repression of the regime in Syria, which was brutal repression, which the CIA knew about because the CIA was paying them to torture people. Yes, they did support them afterwards. I mean, I am not going to judge people by where they get support from. If you're in desperate straits, you take support from wherever it comes. The Jordanians have switched sides so frequently, it's difficult to know. They've kept channels open to Israel all along, at the same time maintaining some degree of firmness because so many of their population are Palestinian and they need it. They've toadied up to the Saudis when it suited them and then pulled back. Now they're back in cahoots with Syria. I mean, they've been with Syria before. Remember, the Syrians actually invaded Jordan at the time of Black September. There's a long history going back here. We have to remember, in terms of previous regimes, that the Hashemites actually supported Saddam Hussein in Iraq when everybody else gave up on him. They stayed, their own peculiar way, loyal. They backed and paid.
I think you're going to have to check the history books, Ian. You're going to have to check the history books. Syria never supported
a whole host of enemies.
Ian, Syria supported Saddam Hussein. When?
Don't you remember? The Jordanians were giving verbal backing to Saddam Hussein at the time of the American invasion.
Okay, now, sorry, pardon me. I thought you said Syria. Okay, the Hashemite.
But the oil for food afterwards.
Right, okay, the Hashemite regime. Okay, we got you.
Hashemite regime, yes. Not King Abdullah, he wasn't.
Right. No, pardon me, I thought you said Syria. Okay.
But, I mean, they paid a penalty for it as well.
Okay.
Because they suffered from American sanctions afterwards.
Right.
But at the same time, the Americans didn't dare disavow them because the last thing they wanted was a hostile Jordan.
Ian, how do you know?
In a precarious position,
right, yeah,
but
I got it wrong.
It's a fulcrum in the area. Ian. Like King Sihanouk in Cambodia.
I got you, Ian. I got you. I thought you were referring to Syria. Yeah, the Hashemite regime. Okay, they supported Saddam. How do you know how can we know that
Syria supported Saddam as well at a large extent.
The Syrians?
Well, they didn't. They'd actually backed the Gulf War against him. They sent troops to fight with the Americans against Iraq. There's not much room for solidarity and Arab unity here. All of these regimes
the Syrians
are backstabbing, self-serving, self-preservative.
The Syrians backed troops against Iraq. Let's put that aside.
The Syrians had troops as part of Desert Storm.
Okay, let's put that aside. Let's go back to the issue at hand.
Alliance of Desert Storm.
Let's go back to the issue at hand, Ian. How do you know that it was instigated within Syria itself? When we had so much terrorist groups in Syria, the reporters who did make it there,
civil insurrections in the cities which were brutally put down by the Syrian military.
But how do we know that?
They could have negotiated. They didn't. They went for repression, torture, and mass executions.
How do you know that, Ian?
Let Syria burn. They're on the record.
Ian, how do you know that?
Without Saddam, let Syria burn was well, not we don't know without Saddam, without Assad.
Okay, Ian.
Let Syria burn was what they were saying.
Ian,
it's all documented. It's
Ian,
all in history, and it's in different languages as well.
Ian, how do you know that when you had reporters that went to Syria and came back without a head? They beheaded them.
Well, they didn't come back then, did they?
Okay, Tony, what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, what we're hearing at the moment is actually ancient history. With the Russian intervention in Syria, what we've said, and of course they had to do that in order to preserve their naval base in the Mediterranean. I say they had to. They decided on a military basis that it was just not feasible to stop the Russian presence, naval presence in the Mediterranean, and so that's why they came into President Assad's aid. I also believe there is a tremendous amount of evidence that right from the very beginning, the United States was getting arms through to these various Takfiri groups, ISIS groups, Al-Qaeda groups, etc., that were involved in that whole Syria business. Anyway, the point is now that everything is very different in the Middle East. The United States power is waning. Actually, the Israeli power is waning because it's become obvious and evident to those countries surrounding that part of the world what's been going on for years. And this is a US intervention, effectively, along with the British and the Israelis, in order to destabilize the region. And now everyone is woken up to that, including most of the populations, particularly in Lebanon. What we're seeing is a great, really, I mean, similar thing, what happened in South America, which is a rejection of the US influence and the British influence and the complete lack of trust in the British and the Americans, and seeing them as in league with the Israelis in trying to balkanize the region to do effectively what happened in Europe in the 1930s with Germany, which was to destabilize surrounding countries to expand their territory. And I think that that's kind of been brought to a halt now. And most of the surrounding countries around Israel have realised what's going on. Now, they're being destabilised in different ways, like Lebanon, for example.
I haven't got much time. Let me just bring Ian back.
The Jordanians, can I just finish, please? The Jordanians have absolutely woken up to this now. And I think it's very good news that Assad and Abdullah are on the phone to each other today. Excellent news.
Ian.
I don't think they've had to wake up now. I don't believe there's anyone in the Middle East for the last deep suspicions about American and British influence there. So this is not a revelation. I'm not even sure that Israel is more powerful than ever before, or its power is weakening, sorry. It doesn't look like it from the side. It doesn't look like it from the point of view of the people in Gaza getting bombed on a daily basis, or the people in Lebanon getting strafed by the Israelis.
Yeah, the Israelis are weakening themselves by those actions. The Israelis are actually destroying their own credibility by killing their own people.
They have credibility in the region to begin with.
Okay, you might want to ask the settlers who are on the other side of the missiles in Operation Swords of Al-Quds. Let's thank our guests for their contribution and their time. Ian Williams, Senior Analyst at Foreign Policy in Focus, joining us from New York, and Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist, joining us out of the British city of Bristol. And that brings an end to this edition of the News Review.